Something happened at the Washington Hilton on the night of the White House Correspondents' Dinner that every single American, regardless of party, regardless of who you voted for, needs to see and understand. Not because it's political ammunition, not because it scores points for anyone, but because the man holding the most powerful office on the face of this earth could not walk out of a hotel ballroom under his own power. That is not opinion. That is not spin. That is what the cameras caught. And it is something that no amount of press conference theatre, no golden ballroom speech, and no doctor's note about golf victories is going to erase. We are talking about Trump's health, the fall at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the cover-up that's been building for years, and the medical records this administration absolutely refuses to release. And we're not going to look away from it. Not here, not tonight, not ever. If this is your first time here and you believe that power should be held accountable, that the American people deserve the truth about who is actually running this country, hit that subscribe button right now and join this community. Because what we're about to walk through tonight is something the mainstream press has been dancing around for months, and somebody has to say it straight. Let's start with what actually happened at that dinner, because there's been a lot of noise around it, and I want to cut through all of it and focus on what the video evidence shows, nothing more, nothing less. The White House Correspondents' Dinner took place at the Washington Hilton. It's an annual tradition, a formal event, packed with press, politicians, dignitaries and cameras everywhere. There is no shortage of footage. And what that footage captured is something that should have been the lead story on every single major news network in America the following morning. When an incident occurred inside that ballroom and the Secret Service moved to escort the President of the United States out of the room, Donald Trump could not walk in a straight line. He couldn't do it. The agents around him, trained professionals whose entire job is to move quickly, efficiently, and with total composure, were visibly jarred. You could see it. These are people who are supposed to be unshakable, and they were shaken, because the man they were trying to move was not moving the way a person in control of their body moves. They told him he needed to get up. They told him more than once, and when he finally did rise and begin moving toward the exit, he went down. He fell flat. Not a stumble, not a trip over a cable, not a moment where someone bumped into him, he fell. And the Secret Service had to physically catch him, hold him up, and essentially drag him out of that room. That is what happened. And before anyone tries to explain this away as a one-time thing, as a slip, as anything other than what it looks like, I need you to hold that image in your mind as we walk through everything else, because this is not a one-time thing. This is a pattern. This is an escalation of something we have been watching develop for a long time now, and the people responsible for informing the American public have largely looked the other way. What makes the Correspondents' Dinner moment even more striking is the reaction on Trump's face in the footage. As this incident is unfolding, as the Secret Service is scrambling, as the room is reacting, Trump is caught on camera almost smirking. It's a strange, disconnected expression. And I'm not diagnosing him, I'm not a doctor, but I am someone who watches human behavior for a living, and that expression, that flat, slightly bemused look in the middle of what should have been a frightening and disorienting moment, is the kind of thing that raises serious questions, not political questions, medical questions. Now let's talk about what came immediately after, because the press conference that followed this incident is almost as alarming as the incident itself. Within roughly half an hour of being escorted out of that ballroom, half an hour after falling and needing to be physically supported by his security detail, Donald Trump stood in front of cameras for a press conference, and rather than address what had just happened to him, rather than offer any explanation or reassurance to the American people, he launched into a speech about why the White House needs a golden ballroom. That is not a joke. That is what he said. He talked about how the Washington Hilton is not a secure enough building, how the country needs a dedicated ballroom at the White House with bulletproof glass and drone-proof construction, and how the Secret Service and the military have been demanding this ballroom for 150 years. A golden ballroom, that was the response. But here's what made it worse. During that very press conference, the one held to apparently address the security concerns raised by the evening's incident, Donald Trump fell asleep, on camera, with Kash Patel speaking right next to him, his eyes closed, his head drooped, and the man looked like he was drifting into deep sleep in front of a room full of reporters and cameras. And this was not an isolated moment. We have seen this happen at press conference after press conference in recent months. It has become a pattern so consistent, so undeniable, that it would be journalistic malpractice to keep describing each individual instance as a one-off anomaly. When a person repeatedly falls asleep in the middle of their own public events, events they scheduled, events they called, events where they are supposed to be in command, that is a symptom. That is something a doctor needs to evaluate. That is something the American public deserves to know about. The drug pricing press conference from earlier that same week, another instance of Trump visibly losing consciousness at the podium. His eyes glazed, his posture collapsed, his attention completely gone, not tired, not bored, something more concerning than either of those things. And the people around him keep pretending it isn't happening. The staff keeps talking, the cameras keep rolling, and America keeps being told that this man is in excellent health. We'll get to exactly how they're defining excellent health in a few minutes, and I promise you it will make your jaw drop. Before we get to the medical records, and we absolutely are going to get to the medical records, we need to go back to Butler, Pennsylvania, because Butler, Pennsylvania is the foundation of everything. It's where the cover-up started, and it's where the credibility of every health claim made by this administration began to collapse. In July of 2024, at a campaign rally in Butler, an assassination attempt was made on Donald Trump's life. A gunman opened fire. The official story, repeated endlessly by Trump's team, by conservative media, by Trump himself, was that he was shot in the ear by a high-powered rifle bullet, an AR-15 round, and survived. He bled. He raised his fist. He became a symbol. They sold the merchandise within hours. Fight, fight, fight. It became the defining image of his political resurrection. But here's what they did not do. They did not release the medical records from Butler Memorial Hospital, where Trump was taken and treated after the shooting. They promised they would. They said transparency was coming. And instead of records, instead of documentation, instead of the kind of evidence you'd expect when the sitting president has been struck by a rifle bullet, what the American public got was a letter from Ronnie Jackson, a Republican congressman, a Trump loyalist, and a former White House physician who said he had reviewed the records and that everything was consistent with a gunshot wound to the ear, not the records themselves. A letter from a partisan ally summarizing what he claims the records say. That is not transparency. That is the opposite of transparency. That is a man with a political stake in the outcome telling you to trust him instead of showing you the evidence. And then there was the Joe Rogan interview. Trump showed Rogan his ear. He pointed to a tiny mark, barely visible, and explained that he's a fast healer, that his lobe heals quickly, that the bullet grazed him and the wound closed up without much of a scar. An AR-15 round, at relatively close range, left almost no visible mark because the man's earlobe heals fast. That's the official story. And I'm not saying I know exactly what happened in Butler. I'm saying that the story they've told does not hold together, the evidence they've presented does not match the claims they've made, and the records they promised have never materialized. And now when Trump falls at the correspondents' dinner and can't walk out of a ballroom, the same pattern repeats: deflect, perform, exploit, but never show the actual documentation. Marjorie Taylor Greene herself, one of Trump's most loyal congressional allies, has publicly asked why the information about the Butler shooter hasn't been fully released. She's asking why there appears to be a cover-up. When your own base is asking those questions, that tells you something. We are now in 2026. Let that sink in for a moment. We are more than a year into Donald Trump's second term. And in all of that time, the American people have not received a single credible, independently verifiable, comprehensive medical report on the health of the President of the United States. What they have received is something that I genuinely struggled to believe was real the first time I read it, a document produced by the White House physician, Dr. Sean Barbarella, that describes Trump's health in terms that would be laughable if the stakes weren't so serious. The April 2025 annual physical concluded that Trump remains in, quote, excellent health, exhibiting robust cardiac, pulmonary, neurological, and general function. Fine, that's standard language. But then it goes further. The document notes as evidence of the president's good health that his schedule includes frequent victories in golf events. Frequent victories in golf events, that is in a medical report. That is cited as a health indicator by a physician whose job is to provide objective clinical assessments of the most powerful person on the planet. This isn't medicine, this is marketing. And it gets worse. The same report lists Trump's weight as 224 pounds, his height as somewhere between 6'3" and 6'4". Anyone who has looked at Donald Trump in recent years, and I mean really looked, not at the filtered photos, not at the carefully angled press images, but at the candid footage, knows that 224 pounds is not an accurate number for this man's body. We're talking about a person who is visibly, substantially larger than that figure suggests. Medical professionals who have commented publicly on this put the realistic estimate considerably higher. And when a medical report contains a weight figure that is obviously, demonstrably inconsistent with observable reality, the entire document loses its credibility. Because if they're willing to lie about something as basic and measurable as weight, what else are they willing to lie about? Here's another number that matters: April 2026. That is when Trump's next annual physical was due, based on the schedule established by the April 2025 exam. It is now the end of April 2026. Where is the report? Where is the documentation? There was a semi-annual checkup at Walter Reed back in October 2025, and even that one raised more questions than it answered. Advanced imaging was mentioned, an MRI was conducted, and when reporters pressed Trump directly about what part of his body was being scanned, he said, and this is real, "I have no idea, it was just an MRI." Then he said it wasn't the brain, because he took a cognitive test and aced it, and then he walked away. The President of the United States had an MRI, cannot or will not say what part of his body it was examining, and considers the conversation closed because he claims to have done well on a cognitive screening test at some prior point in time. That is what passes for medical transparency in this administration. This matters, and I need you to stay with me here because I know there are people watching who are exhausted, who are overwhelmed, who have been told so many things by so many people that they've started to tune it all out. I understand that. But this particular question, the physical and cognitive fitness of the person holding the nuclear codes, the person making decisions about war and peace, the person whose signature goes on legislation that affects your healthcare, your retirement, your children's future, this question cannot be tuned out. It is the most fundamental question in a democracy. Is the person governing this country capable of governing this country? And what we are seeing on camera, repeatedly, consistently, in 2026, is a person whose physical capabilities are visibly diminishing. We have footage of Trump meeting with Vladimir Putin and struggling to walk in a straight line, not striding confidently into the room the way a president is supposed to enter a room, zigzagging, unsteady. We have footage of the Japanese Prime Minister essentially guiding Trump through a meeting space, gently steering him the way you'd help an elderly relative navigate an unfamiliar room. We have the falls, the stumbles, the moments where the people around him have to intervene physically to keep him upright. And now we have the White House Correspondents' Dinner, captured on multiple camera angles, showing the President of the United States being dragged out of a hotel ballroom because he cannot walk on his own. This is your midpoint. And if you've made it this far, it means you care about this enough to keep going, which means you should be subscribed. Hit that button, share this, because the people who need to hear this conversation aren't going to find it on the networks that have spent the last year softening every edge, qualifying every observation, and refusing to say plainly what the cameras are showing. We say it plainly here, always have, always will. And let's be equally plain about the cognitive piece, because the physical decline doesn't exist in isolation. It comes alongside a documented pattern of verbal confusion, of losing the thread mid-sentence, of making statements that contradict each other within the same press conference, of claiming victories in situations that are demonstrably not victories, of describing situations, the Strait of Hormuz, the Iran negotiations, the war outcomes, in terms that bear no relationship to the documented reality on the ground. When Trump says the Strait of Hormuz is open, and it is not open, when he says Iran wants to meet with him, and Iranian officials have explicitly and publicly said the opposite, when he says the Epstein files have been released, and they have not been fully released, that is not spin, that is not political framing, that is a detachment from verifiable reality that demands a medical explanation, not a political one. I want to address something directly, because there are going to be people who watch this and say you're just playing politics, you don't care about his health, you're using this as an attack. And I want to be very clear about something. The question of a president's cognitive and physical fitness is not a partisan question. It was not partisan when it was asked about Joe Biden, and it was a legitimate question then, one that ultimately proved to have real substance, and it is not partisan now. If anything, the standard should be consistent. If you demanded transparency from Biden's medical team, and you should have, then you must demand the same from Trump's. If you accepted that cognitive decline in a sitting president was a matter of urgent public concern when it was a Democrat in the White House, then you must accept it now. There is no intellectually honest way to hold a different standard. None. And what makes this particular situation even more urgent is the family history that Trump himself has acknowledged and then retreated from. His father, Fred Trump, suffered from severe Alzheimer's disease. It is a matter of documented public record. Alzheimer's has a known hereditary component. That doesn't mean Donald Trump has Alzheimer's. I am not diagnosing him. I am saying that a man with his family history at his age, exhibiting the behavioral patterns we are documenting on camera, has an obligation to submit to comprehensive, transparent, independently verified medical evaluation, not a letter from a loyalist, not a doctor's note that references golf scores, real documentation, released to the public, reviewed by independent physicians. That is what the gravity of this office demands. That is what the American people are owed, because at the end of the day, at the very core of all of this, the question isn't really about Trump. The question is about governance. If the President of the United States is not cognitively or physically capable of fully executing the duties of that office, then someone else is making those decisions. Someone who was not elected, someone whose name does not appear on the ballot, someone the American people did not choose, and that is not a small thing. That is a constitutional crisis in slow motion. That is the kind of thing that historians write about in the past tense, the moment when a nation's institutions failed to ask the obvious question before it was too late. So where does that leave us? It leaves us here, right now, at the end of April 2026, watching a man who cannot walk out of a ballroom be shielded from basic medical scrutiny by a system that has decided political loyalty matters more than public truth. It leaves us with a missing annual physical, an unexplained MRI, a Butler Hospital report that was promised and never delivered, a semi-annual checkup that raised more questions than it answered, and a physician's note that cites golf victories as evidence of robust neurological function. It leaves us with footage, clear, undeniable, multi-angle footage of the President of the United States falling down, being carried, sleeping at press conferences, zigzagging through diplomatic meetings, and struggling through basic physical movement that the average person takes for granted. And it leaves us with an administration that responds to all of it by talking about a golden ballroom, by selling merchandise, by attacking the reporters who ask follow-up questions, by calling the questioners failing and incompetent, by walking out of press conferences the moment the scrutiny gets specific. This is the playbook. Deflect, perform, attack, but never ever show the actual records. The American people are not stupid. I want to say that as clearly as I possibly can. The people watching this, the people working 2 jobs to pay their bills, the people worried about their prescriptions costs and their kids' futures, they are not stupid. They can see what's on the camera. They can hear what doesn't add up. They know the difference between a leader who is transparent and one who is hiding. They've been gaslit enough. They've been told to ignore their own eyes enough. And they deserve better than a medical system that produces propaganda instead of documentation, better than a press corps that softens every observation out of fear of being called partisan, and better than an administration that treats basic questions about presidential fitness as acts of aggression rather than acts of civic responsibility. Show the Butler records. Release the 2026 annual physical, have the MRI results reviewed by an independent panel of physicians, and make those results public. Allow genuine, independent, non-partisan medical evaluation of the President of the United States. That is not a radical demand. That is the bare minimum. That is what this office has always required, what the American people have always been entitled to, and what this administration has systematically, deliberately, and consistently refused to provide. The cover-up culture runs deep here, from the Epstein files to the Iran negotiations to the Butler investigation to the medical records. Everything is classified. Everything is delayed, everything is deflected, and everything is sold as strength when it is actually concealment. We are not going to stop asking. We are not going to soften the question to make powerful people comfortable. We are not going to pretend that what we are seeing with our own eyes is not what it is. That is not journalism. That is complicity. And complicity is not something we do here. If this conversation matters to you, if you believe that a free press asking hard questions is not an attack on America but the lifeblood of it, then subscribe, share this video, and leave a comment below telling me what you think needs to happen next. Because the conversation doesn't end when the video does, it continues in the comment section. It continues when you share it with someone who needs to hear it. and it continues every single time we refuse to look away from something that powerful people are desperate for us to ignore. This community exists because enough people decided that comfortable silence is not an option anymore. And as long as that's true, we will keep doing exactly what we're doing, showing up, speaking plainly, and holding the line, every single time.